Good morning, lovelies. To prologue or not to prologue? That is the question we're going to be answering today. Prologues are a mixed bag. People seem to think that they're either the absolutely necessary, you cannot write a novel without writing a prologue, and other people seem to think that it's the worst thing to happen to literature since ever. That it just bogs down your opener, losing your audience before they even reach chapter 1. And honestly, both are true. Some stories do need a prologue, and sometimes they really don't. Readers have been burned so many times that a lot of them groan at just the word prologue. So it's important to know whether writing one is absolutely necessary for your unique story, or if you should just go ahead with chapter 1. For the absolute noobs out there watching this video, a prologue is the part of the story that takes place before the beginning of the actual tale, before even chapter 1. It is defined by its distance from the main story, either by time, character point of view, and or physical distance. But whatever happens in the prologue has a direct impact on the rest of the story. It often portrays the first domino to fall in the series of events that we're about to see unfold. Got it? Good. The first question that you as a writer must ask yourself is the information in this prologue necessary to understanding the rest of the story? Basically, if you can skip the prologue and still completely understand the novel, delete the prologue. This is true of every part of your story. Every single scene is you should be asking yourself this question, but it is especially true of the prologue because the first few pages are your reader's first impression of you and your story. If the prologue is bad or rambling or unnecessary, your readers are going to close your book and never pick it up again. The stereotype among fantasy novels is that the prologue is where we get all of the lore and the world building in a really dry textbook-like fashion, because the audience is just incapable of understanding the rest of the story unless they know the exact ritual that the gods used to create the whole world. This may have worked in earlier works of fiction, but not today. Half the time that exposition is not necessary at all. Delete it. Or better yet, what I've found is that instead of completely deleting whole scenes or chapters or chunks of exposition from your manuscript as you're writing it, copy and paste it onto a new document. This will allow you to re-enter it into the story quickly and easily if it turns out that, yeah, you actually do need this stuff in there. And if not, if it's not necessary, well then you have something cool to show to your patrons on Patreon or your newsletter subscribers. It's like when famous movies release deleted scenes. It's fun, and it makes you a much more ruthless editor and writer because you're not getting rid of all this extra stuff that you find fascinating. You're just stashing it somewhere else to be pulled out later. A good example of a necessary prologue with vital information that we need up front is Finding Nemo. The writers originally had the dead wife reveal happen later in the movie, but the problem with that is that Marlin becomes a lot less sympathetic, and test audiences just couldn't connect with him. The audience needs to know what happened to his wife and the other eggs up front to not only understand where he's coming from, but to sympathize with and to like him, even as he's smothering his son. This type of character backstory given in the prologue is a favorite of Pixar, as we see it in several of their other works, most notably The Incredibles and Up. The movie Up simply would not be as effective as it is without introducing Carl and Ellie as children and the whole marriage montage. We see the pivotal role that Paradise Falls plays into their relationship and how much it meant to Ellie. We see how they built the house together, and that Carl doesn't really have a life outside of his wife despite their attempts to have children, so when she died, he didn't really have anything except the house that they built together. This prologue tells us everything that we need to know about Carl right out the gate. So when the company attempts to take his house away, we don't need any awkward exposition on why it means so much to him. We already know how devastating losing his home would be at this point. An excellent book example would be Dread Nation, which has a prologue only 2 pages long. The narrator and main character tells us about the day she was born, namely that she is a black girl born to a white mother on a southern plantation during the Civil War. Since we get it from her perspective, she's heard this story from a variety of different, sometimes contradicting sources. We also get a good idea of her character and who she considers trustworthy. Hint, it's not her mom. The prologue ends by telling us that 2 days after her birth, the dead rose during the Battle of Gettysburg, starting a zombie apocalypse. Chapter 1 takes place almost 20 years later. This sets up several of the main characters' core conflicts and issues regarding her family and society, which drives most of her actions through the rest of the novel. Justina Ireland could have delivered this information to us without a prologue, but it wouldn't have set the stage so concisely and quickly, and that's what a good prologue does. Again, it's only 2 pages long. Prologues do not have to be long. In fact, agents and editors advise them to be short. Really short. Shorter than your usual chapter length so we can get to the actual story. I've seen prologues that are only 1 page and they work beautifully, but it's very rare for a prologue to be long and also interesting and necessary. Brandon Sanderson is the only one that I've seen consistently pull it off, and we'll get to him. He just breaks all the rules anyway. The best prologues are basically a very quick whispered, hey, before you dive in, you just need to know X, Y, and Z. Got it? Okay, have fun. That's it. If that quick little aside is long and rambling, then you're gonna lose your audience and need to find a better way to deliver that information, if it needs to be delivered at all. If the information in your prologue is necessary for your audience, then ask yourself if there's a better way to share that information throughout the novel instead of front-loading it at the beginning. Does the audience need to know this information now at the beginning, or can it wait? A really good example, Game of Thrones prologue tells us about the ice zombies, which we need to know early on to understand the danger that Jon is in when he decides to join the Night's Watch, as well as letting us know that, hey, magic is real, by the way, we don't really talk about it until 50 chapters in. Without that prologue, the ice zombie reveal halfway through the book would have felt like it was coming out of nowhere, rather than properly foreshadowed and given with a sense of dread and dramatic irony. You'll also note that we don't get all the information about the White Walkers in that prologue. Nothing about the Long Night or the different hierarchies of zombies or any of that. This is partly to help drive home just how forgotten all of this information, but also it's not necessary yet. We don't need to start learning about it until Jon does, although we get little glimpses and snippets earlier, like when Bran is asking for a scary story and Old Nan starts to tell him about the Long Night before she's interrupted. It's teased and foreshadowed, but not given in its entirety. By not giving us the whole history lesson on the Long Night and White Walkers, Martin enhances the mystery. He makes us curious, makes us want to keep reading to find out just what is up with these ice zombies and how is our cast supposed to deal with them. Another example is my book, Citadel. I need my audience to know that the main character, Olivia, had a boyfriend named Elias who was killed in a centuries-long war against the creatures of the flooded forest, and that everyone thinks that those creatures are demons. So the prologue is Elias's last night alive. It's him fighting in that war and getting killed. It gives the audience all that necessary information, as well as a, hey, this book has life or death stakes, rather than being a cozy mystery. Citadel comes out June 20th. The pre-order link is in the description of this video. But again, not all books require a prologue. Scythe doesn't have one because it doesn't need one. All the information we get about scythes and how and why they kill people and the political net that they found themselves in over the centuries is given to us throughout the course of the novel. We learn about it at the same time the main characters do, and that's fine. It's perfect, actually, and you should read this book because it's really fucking good. A lot of it comes down to how much information you want the reader to have. Does the story work best with the use of dramatic irony, the audience knowing something that the characters don't? A lot of tragedies and horror stories use this, telling the audience that these characters are doomed for whatever reason right out the gate, or that there's a scary monster that's going to be hunting them down, putting the audience on pins and needles as we're watching this train crash unfold. Or does the story work best if the audience doesn't know the first time around what the ice zombies are up to, or that Anakin Skywalker is going to become Darth Vader? The Aragon book probably would have been better without a prologue. We don't need to know about these other characters until much later. In this case, heightened mystery is better than dramatic irony. For you Shakespeare nerds, imagine reading or watching Romeo and Juliet without the prologue, which explicitly tells the audience that these two star-crossed lovers take their lives. Imagine watching it without knowing that they're dead. The first half of the story would lead you to believe that this is a romantic dramedy, and that the main tension and narrative is going to revolve around Romeo and Juliet's families finding out, and freaking out, about their relationship. Tense, sure, but there's nothing in the first act that tells us that any of this is going to be lethal or tragic. until Romeo's best bud Mercutio dies and Romeo kills Tybalt in retaliation, officially tipping the dominoes of destruction. But that happens at the midpoint, well into the story. Without the explicit knowledge that shit's gonna go down, the audience would feel ripped off. It'd be like a late Game of Thrones plot twist that doesn't actually make any sense. Shock for the sake of shock rather than good storytelling. But because we know that this is going to end badly, we're waiting with bated breath as Romeo's walking on sunshine and Juliet's waxing poetic. And while there's still some surprise at Mercutio getting killed because he's the comic relief character and he's not a member of the warring families, it's the type of shock that keeps us interested. It stays in line with the overall tone of the story, rather than the author going, aha, I tricked you, I bet you feel stupid for thinking that this is all gonna end just fine. You always have to keep reader expectations in mind and know when it's the right time to stick with them or to subvert them. A more modern use of dramatic irony delivered through the prologue is Prince of Egypt, which uses its prologue to give us character backstory that the character doesn't even know about. The heartbreaking song Deliver Us tells us about the slaves of Egypt, the murder of the babies, and of course, Moses being sent up the river and becoming a prince. These are all things that we need to know right away, but Moses can't know because of his character development. He has to start the story as a spoiled prince who doesn't think anything about the slavery thing. So when he's faced with the truth that he's from a family of enslaved Jews and that his adopted father is a monster, it fucks with his head, triggers a manslaughter against an overseer, and forces him to leave his home so that he can figure himself out and return as the Messiah. All of that in the first act, where there is no time for awkward, clunky exposition. There's no time for Moses' blood relatives to sit him down and go, hey, the Pharaoh ordered you and every other baby killed, so our mom sent you up the river where you got picked up by the queen and adopted into the family. Surprise! It also helps that the audience is already very familiar with the story of Moses, so trying to keep his heritage under wraps would just be a waste of time. 99% of America is raised Christian. We know. There is no mystery here. We know how this is gonna go down. Deliver Us gets it out of the way and makes us cry at the same time. As I mentioned earlier, most of the well-written prologues have three elements. They take place a good chunk of time before the start of the book. This is optional. They often include a point of view character that we do not get elsewhere in the story. Also optional. And they give us the required information that we need to understand what's happening early in the book. This is almost always mandatory. And of course, the best prologues do it with emotionalism. They're not a dry article. They include fully fleshed out characters with thoughts and feelings and maybe a little narrative arc. The best prologues are full scenes where the characters involved want something, try to get it, and then either fail or succeed. In my novel Citadel, Elias desperately tries to survive his mission to kill the demons, and things go horribly wrong and he ultimately fails. It's a full scene with a beginning, middle, and end, and it also shows the reader this war of extermination and the human cost of it. And since it takes place about a year before the rest of the story, I knew that it would work better as a prologue, where I could really dive into how these characters struggled and felt while fighting for their lives, rather than awkwardly shoehorning in a flashback or a scene somewhere in Act 1 where Olivia sits someone down and explains what happened, which would not make sense for her to do because everyone already knows. The relationship was not a secret and she's one of the most famous people in town. And I already have a flashback in Act 1 anyway where I go into how Olivia's mother was executed by the state, so having a second flashback so soon would just be confusing and weird. Yeah, Olivia goes through some shit. So I would have had to wait until Act 2 where she leaves Citadel to do that, but then we get a Finding Nemo situation. None of Olivia's motivation or state of mind up to that point would have made sense, and that would have been more annoying for the reader than intriguing. Thus, prologue. Another great example is The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Each book in the series has a prologue that covers the assassination of the king, which launches the country into a war that's still going on years later when Chapter 1 starts. He's also killed with magic, the same type that Kaladin starts learning in Book 1, but almost none of the other characters know is even a thing. thing. So again, that would have come right out of left field. But we, the audience, need to know about it, which is why the assassin uses it in the prologue. The cool thing about Stormlight is that the prologue of each book covers the exact same event, the assassination of the king, but from a different character's point of view. A lot of things happened that night that influenced the rest of the series, but we don't need to know all of it at once. Just enough to understand what's happening in this specific book. So book 1's prologue is told from the assassin's point of view, telling us that this country ordered that guy dead and that they wanted it done publicly with magic. That launches the war that dominates the rest of the book and also gives us a sneak peek about the magic that Kaladin will be using. Book 2 is from the point of view of the king's daughter, who's been dabbling with magic herself, saw that the king was in some sort of secret meeting, and was also able to question the people who ordered the hit, giving us a little more context for what happens in book 2. Book 3 is from a new character, Ishani, who is one of those who ordered the hit. She's a major character in book 3 that we haven't met before, and they're about to completely change the game with a new type of magic that, as it turns out, they were trying to prevent the king from waking up because it's so destructive. That's why they had him killed, which is tragic because they end up waking that power themselves to survive the war that they inadvertently started. Book 4, we get the queen's perspective and some of her backstory and struggles, which is important as she goes from a minor character from the first 3 books to a major player in book 4. You get the picture. Now, you don't have to have such a time jump of months or years between the prologue and the first chapter. Sometimes the prologue can even be a scene that happens later in the book, telling us that these characters are gonna die or be in danger or whatever, like a sneak peek. But rather than a Romeo and Juliet situation where the narrator is just telling it, we actually see the scene itself. We see something like this in Breaking Bad, Mission Impossible 3, that type of thing. This is technically called In Medias Res, where we start the story in the middle or even near the end and then go back to the beginning, but it's effectively a prologue. That trick has been used so much and by so many writers and done so poorly that Rick and Morty actually made fun of it, so be cautious with this one. It all goes back to that dramatic irony thing. For a really good example, the movie Premium Rush opens with the main character Wiley getting hit by a taxi at 6 p.m. He's badly hurt, his love interest is there and worried, and then we rewind to earlier that day. This movie plays around with time a lot, introducing us to major characters like the villain and then the damsel, and then rewinding again and again to tell us how they got into their respective situations. It's done really well. We are constantly reminded about the time as it passes as we get closer and closer to that car crash, which seriously hinders Wiley's goal of delivering the package on time to, as it turns out, save a young boy. Without that little tidbit of knowledge that he's gonna crash, we the audience wouldn't be nearly as concerned about Wiley and what he's getting up to. Going back to Game of Thrones, the White Walker prologue happens only a few days or weeks before chapter 1, and the prologue for The Dark Knight Rises shows us how the new villain Bane is ruthless, intelligent, and targeting Gotham City for something a few days before Batman actually hears about him. Introducing the villain in the prologue is very common because it tells the audience what type of threat the hero is going up against. It makes us wonder, oh, what the heck is this guy up to, and worry about it before being introduced to whoever we're supposed to be rooting for. Villain prologues are also good for stories that have a different tone than what the first few chapters would have you believe. Much like Romeo and Juliet, it lets the audience know that this is indeed a horror story or a creepy sci-fi or a tragedy. It allows the first act to be happy and funny and show us what type of life the characters are leading before it all goes to shit. Captain America's prologue shows us how Schmidt and the Nazis are using the Tesseract to up their military game. This introduces the superhero element in the beginning of the story rather than waiting half an hour for the start of Act 2 and the super soldier serum. The Tesseract also shows us why the US is trying to create a super soldier in the first place. The Nazis have a supernatural element, so they need one too. So we get required information about why the US is doing what they're doing, some dramatic irony on what Steve Rogers is going to be facing once he bulks up a little bit, and a heads up that this is a superhero movie rather than a more realistic war drama. Without that prologue, the super soldiers thing would be a serious swerve. The first Lord of the Rings movie did the same thing with its prologue. Now granted, this is the classic story of the Dark Lord and world building lore that modern fantasy writers are warned against doing these days, but it still holds up because it establishes the proper tone and the dangers that Frodo and the other hobbits are going to be up against. We get this gritty, dark prologue of a desperate war against Sauron and the One Ring that claimed the lives of kings and corrupted their loved ones before vanishing into ancient legend. And then we cut to the idyllic Shire, with rolling green hills and happy children and fireworks. We know all about the One Ring and that it's having a negative effect on Bilbo, all of which is necessary information that we need up front. But even so, most of Act 1 is really chill. Merry and Pippin play pranks, Sam is shy and nervous around his crush, Frodo is laughing and happier than we ever see him again. Watching this after the prologue tells us this isn't gonna last, alright? These characters are gonna lose a piece of themselves, their carefree happiness and peace of mind as soon as they step foot outside the Shire. We're invested in their characters and their world, and we want them to succeed, but because of the prologue, we're also waiting for the other shoe to drop. A word of warning, sometimes writers will have a prologue that's really exciting and action-packed because they think that their first chapter is really boring and won't capture their reader's attention. If that's the case, then change your first chapter, if not your entire first act. No part of your manuscript should be boring, and having a really exciting prologue next to a really slow first chapter is just gonna annoy your readers. They're gonna want to go back to the action. Not every story needs a prologue. It's not a requirement, even if they are common. None of my Blackwing books have a prologue, although that's largely because they're novellas rather than full-length novels. I've only got 100 pages to play around with there. Sometimes it's better to just start with chapter 1. And that's okay. You're not gonna lose your status as a writer if you do that. If you want to know if your specific prologue is necessary for your book, then well, you have a couple of options and ways to do that. You can give your manuscript to 2 sets of beta readers. One set that gets the prologue and one set that doesn't. They will both give you feedback and then you adjust accordingly. And or you can have me look at your manuscript in its entirety because I offer critiques for a living. That information is on my website, which is linked in the description. Let me know your thoughts on prologues in the comments below and I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies.